Hi, Jess.
Hey, Matt.
How are you today?
I am wonderful.
That's very, very good to hear. I am also wonderful. I am also very excited. I have had a few interactions over the course of my career with our guest today. Someone who I've looked up to for quite a while, only because for quite a while this individual knew a significant more than I did. And now I've found in the pre call that it's exponentially more than I did. So I'm really excited to be here with him today. And this is definitely a wonderful blast from my past, as I don't think I've had a conversation with this guy in quite a while. So that all being said, Jessica, before we bring him up on stage, I just have one question for you, which is, how's the weather out there?
It is getting better. It's a little cloudy today, but spring is upon us, so no complaints.
I like it. All right.
And I'm
Well, with that
sure
said,
where you're
oh, go ahead.
at, it's beautiful. I'm sure where it's at, it's beautiful. So
We are
rub it in.
actually, yeah, I don't want to be too, what's the word I'm looking for here? Boastful or braggart about where I'm at. But it was a gorgeous morning. And we're getting actually ready for those of you who are internet open source sleuths out there. We're getting ready for a golf tournament up in this area. So I'll throw that out there as a where is Matt today kind of a thing. But nonetheless, let's get our guest up here on stage. Jason Rebholz, are you with us, sir?
Hey, thanks for having me.
There he is. There he is. Jason, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us on Cyber on the Edge. I'm really happy that we were able to connect and get you on the show. First off, because not only are you a kind of, someone who's been involved in a lot of different spaces, I think, over the course of your career, but also someone who a lot of folks on LinkedIn might recognize because, and I should say YouTube and other sort of channels as well, because you put out a lot of great content. And I don't want to take too much of your introduction. Just want to say, for those of you who are like, wait a second, I recognize that guy. Let's go ahead and hear a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where you're from.
Yeah, I am the CISO at Corvus Insurance, and I have a pretty unique role for a CISO, and it really stems from my background, which I'll talk a little bit about. But my role is part internal security, part threat intel, but mainly looking at it from a perspective of how does it impact, how do threat trends impact cyber insurance. And then I also have a risk advisory team that I like to think of them as a bunch of mini virtual CISOs that exist to inform our underwriters, support them, but most importantly, inform and support our policyholders. And so when I think about security, I think about it in the lens of I'm protecting my organization, but I'm also protecting tens of thousands of organizations at the same time. And it is a really, really fun game to play. I intentionally orchestrated this because of my background, where I was born and raised in incident response, and so that's where I know Matt from at our time at Mandiant together, where we got to kind of cut our teeth on some pretty interesting cases, right? I started right out of college, not knowing anything about forensics. I remember my first day showing up to Mandiant's office, thinking I was going to be a pen tester, by the way. And they hand me a hard drive and they say, "Here you go. Tell us everything that happened on it." And I was like, "Well, how do I do that?" And so, it's one of those things where you very fortunate in my career to just be in the right time at the right place. And Mandiant was just a hotbed for forensics talent. And so I was a sponge. I learned as much as I possibly could. I asked a lot of stupid questions along the way, and you ask enough stupid questions, and those questions start to get smarter over time, and then you start to kind of figure it out yourself. And yeah, that's I really learned security in the middle of incident response. So when everything goes wrong, and that's like fundamentally shaped the way that I think about security, which is probably like the complete antithesis to compliance. But for me, I look at it as how are attacks going to happen? What are the most likely attacks that are going to happen? And what do I have to do to defend against those?
Yeah. I got to say, obviously, I'll just give everyone a full bias warning ahead here. Obviously, I'm going to agree with a lot of what Jason says, only because I think there is definitely a little bit of a difference in, and there's not a good or a bad to this. I think it's just a different sides of the same coin of folks who maybe come up through security in kind of that crisis mode of security, meaning you're constantly dealing with an aftermath or kind of the attack has happened versus folks who might come up in a more of a preventative sense, where they have started out in those GRC roles or those specific roles that are geared towards implementing controls and tightening and hardening controls as opposed to responding to things. And I love that we get to see both sides of that in security as well. I think you started to tease this out a little bit, but I'm going to ask you to continue on this one. Kind of leading up to where you are now, how does that, I'm going to call it an affinity with crisis, which is one of the terms that I've kind of come to embrace, which is, and this is going to sound really odd to some folks out there, there is nothing like being in the middle of an incident response. And that's not a claim to fame, nor is it a boastful, nor is it a desire. But, when you're in the middle of the fire and everything just kind of opens up and it's like, we're not talking checkbooks. We're not talking, okay, let's go buy all the things now, right? We're talking all the evidence is laid out in front of you and you're seeing truly just how bad things are, right? And then you've got to say, all right, now the repairing starts. Right. And in any event, what I want to know, Jason, is like, how does that tie into like where you're at now? How did that impact your progression as you moved up to your current role?
So it's a double-edged sword, right? And so I was literally having this conversation yesterday with somebody. The thing with IR is that you get used to a very rapid speed. And so there are a lot of benefits that come with that. I am very comfortable making very difficult decisions with limited information, but with the mindset that we can change our mind if we need to. And so that is really useful in a lot of situations, but it can also be detrimental if you don't check it when it needs to be checked. And so there's this little bit of things where, if you look at a lot of people, and I only learned this after leaving IR, right? And that's a whole transition in and of itself. But, you really recognize that you're operating in the IR mindset at probably 250 miles an hour. The rest of the world, like the normal world, like all the normal people out there, they're probably operating at 50 miles an hour, right? And that's normal, but you don't recognize that right away. And so I have to check myself quite often to say, hey, like not everyone is still running at this speed because I'm terrible at slowing down there. And so I've got to kind of modulate there and say, okay, how can I try to delegate certain things without killing everybody at the same time, recognizing that not everybody is running at the same speed as I am. And so that's something you only learn by making a lot of mistakes. But, when you're looking at it from a security program, and this is what I learned right away, I remember coming in to my first CISO role and being like, okay, I'm going to put together a roadmap, right? I'm do my assessments, find all the gaps. I'm like, okay, here's a 3-year plan of what we need to do. And this is the budget for it. And, you call this out, Matt. It's, you're used to working in an environment where like budgets don't matter. It's just get it done and figure out how to make it work. And then in the real world, that's not the case. Like you have to make trade-offs. And so I remember the first conversation I had with one of the CEOs, and he's just like, okay, well, why do we have to do this? I was like, I actually have to like justify these things now, right? It's like you just know inherently it's the right thing to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do for the business. And that's a really hard distinction to make for a lot of CISOs. And I think a lot of security professionals where you think you know everything that has to happen, but it is not necessarily the best thing for the business. And that's where you kind of have to pull back and say, I don't need a $5 million budget to get this done. I could probably get this done in $1 million. And how would I do this and not introduce or, allow a lot of risk? Because it's just like with everything, even in IR, like you hit a point of diminishing returns. It's the same thing with security projects and programs. Like there is so much effort that goes into certain areas of your security program that you're getting little to no return on effort. So why are you spending so much money on those? And that's where you really have to kind of hone in and figure out like, where's the waste that's not really making you more secure, and how can you reallocate that towards things? And this is something like going back to the IR mindset, because you're so used to seeing the whole field, right? Where you're not just stuck. And I think this is specifically for IR leads, where you're looking at entire environments and how attackers are moving around. Like that type of mindset, you apply that to anything else and you start seeing the bigger picture. And that's like that, you need that skill set as a CISO instead of just focusing down on the nitty gritty details of things.
Yeah, I think that's, you've brought up what I almost, so we've spoken with folks who are CISOs and are former red teamers. And I think they take, I'm not going to call it the opposite view because IR feels very defensive. I would argue and say that IR is actually a common denominator between a lot of the two, because you understand adversarial techniques really well.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, I know exactly what it looks like when someone passes the hash and how to exploit it. And you know it from an aftermath perspective. A red teamer knows how dangerous of a vulnerability it is because of what they can do with it. And I feel like we both have an idea of what the end goal looks like, but we arrive to that conclusion examining it at different points in time. And I was really happy to hear you say this is a necessary thing for CISOs, because you can't get hung up in, the things that might not matter. But I want to turn this is making me think of another question. When you have to then deal with those threats or deal with actual business impact, is that shaped by I know how bad this can be? Is that part of an assessment process you go through?
Yeah, and it's not even a formal process. It's one of those things that you just know from experience, right? And I'll give you an example of this. We had something that we were responding to, and thankfully, knock on wood, I haven't had anything major. And I'd like to toot my own horn for that, but I don't think that's 100% the case. There, luck kind of plays into this quite a bit. But we were going in and investigating, and I looked at the details that we had, it was early on, right? And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this isn't a big deal, right? And I look at my head of security operations, and she's freaking out, this is the worst thing ever. What are we going to do? And I just knew right off the bat that about 50% of what we were seeing was just noise. It was just pure noise. It's like the common thing when you're looking through logs and you see a vulnerability scanner, and the first time you always see that, you freak out. You're like, oh my God, they're all getting attacked. You're like, oh, this is just internet noise, right? And so that's a type of thing where you can quickly de-escalate a situation, because I've seen just hundreds of hours get spent on things that did not matter. And so when you're chasing all of these, incidents, and I use that term with air quotes because a lot of times we make things out to be much worse than they are. Mm-hmm. And we have to be careful there. It's like this weird thing with security people where we always want to go to the worst case thing. And it's almost like paranoia. Mm-hmm. And that's a really good thing to have to be successful in security. But when you only operate in that area, you start to just waste time, and you tend to burn out then, right? And so mm-hmm. I've found myself in my career where I've kind of gone back and forth between the two, and finally realized I just got to live in the middle here. Because I remember one engagement I was working where I had by that time I had done probably 1,000 investigations, right? You could predict everything that was going to happen. You'd get on a scoping call, and you basically tell them what happened, and then you're just trying to find the evidence mm-hmm. And see if it's wrong, right? I'm not recommending that's the way you do an investigation, by the way.
But sometimes you hear the techniques and you're like, I know exactly who this is. Yeah.
It's like playing Mad Libs. It really is. Right. And so, I had a client who pulled me aside and said, hey, you really got to take this more seriously. And I was like, ooh, wow. And it was a gut check to me. Right. It's just because I knew from experience that we're not dealing with anything major, but for that client, mm-hmm. this was the most major thing that they were dealing with. And so this mindset and just being knowing when to go deeper and when to pull back and when it's a crisis and when it's not is really important, because I've got an obligation to notify the CEO. Mm-hmm. I've got an obligation to notify the board. I've got an obligation to notify customers. If I pull that trigger too soon and it's not right, that's a massive problem. And so I typically end up going and seeing and waiting. We had something recently, SentinelOne. They really good product, but they can sometimes detect on their own detections, which is always a fun thing. Mm-hmm. And so we were chasing something with PowerShell, and I was like, "Ooh, this looks face value. It looked really bad, really, really bad." And I literally had something drafted up to the CEO, and I was like, "Let me just hold on a second." I was like, "I want to check a few more things." And it turns out it was a false positive, right? And so you can imagine getting the rest of the company spun up on a false positive doesn't seem like a big deal, but other people have a job and they have to run things. And so it's that focus and really understanding when is it a crisis, when is not, when do you have to deep dive? That's a really important skill. And I've mm-hmm. just found the people who grew up in IR, they have an intrinsic kind of feeling for that versus mm-hmm. others who grew up in just, VMPM or even, pen testers. It's just a different mindset.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can't agree with you. Violent agreement is the word that I'll use here, only because there's plenty of times day to day where, so like, you'll have someone, complain. And I don't want to say complain in a bad way, but you'll have someone report a bug or say, hey, here's a thing that's not working. And an initial instinct is like, okay, well, let me go reproduce it. Right. And the first thing is, let me go reproduce it. And then you're like, well, let me reproduce it. Can I reproduce it on a different operating system? Or do I need to adjust this? Or can I reproduce it as root? Do I need to reproduce it as a lower level user? You kind of go down all these different avenues. Next thing you know, you're 5-6 hours in on analysis, and all the person wanted to know was, do I need this -p flag or not? And and I find that to be an interesting kind of take, where you're like, well, let me just pull on this thread as much as I can. Another thing that you brought up that I wanted to ask you about is, and I'm gonna kind of ask the question and then give you my example and then get your thoughts. The emotional intelligence that comes in security is a lot of times, I don't want to say void, but it's really hard to come about. My example in this one, for anyone who I've met before in I don't want to say a previous life, but in maybe pre-COVID years, I was very, very much into business email compromise investigations and things like that. And I still am very involved in that work, in kind of the research and the threat intel side of it. And I was working a case once where it was a business email compromise, which for anyone who's done those is a dump of M365 logs coupled with a narrative. And for 99% of them, it's fairly, predictable, right? Oh, look for this IP address range, look for this user agent, look for this protocol, and boom, there you go. And that's pretty much almost all the story. And you're sitting there and you're kind of like, okay, analysis is done. And someone's like, that was 24 hours. And you're like, yeah, no, this is pretty predictable stuff. You get to a point where you use these adjectives that are just slightly dismissive and vague because it's another one in your belt, right? I got on a call very similar to the story that you were telling there. Got on a call with the C-suite, and to be very straight up, the case that I was investigating meant 8 people had lost all of their retirement. 2 people had lost their job. And those 2 people, between the 2 of them, had 3 kids. Those are 3 college funds that no longer funded, 2 salaries that weren't coming back anymore. Issues in the house and everything. And a lot of times it's really easy to just see the ones and zeros of the attack, but then to be like, wait a second, no, the theft of this money has an actual emotional damage to some folks. It kind of centers and grounds what I think is that runaway IR mentality. But my question coming out of this for you, after telling my version of it, is, how difficult was it for you, or was it difficult for you to gain that more emotional intelligence side of, okay, now I'm responsible for the security of others, but I also need to deliver this in a way that, makes it or represents, I understand the true impact here.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And, it's something that you really only understand by doing a lot of these investigations. And so I remember I used to tell my consultants that the job is like 75% counselor. The rest of it's the technical side. And, it's there's something to the way that Mandiant had basically grown their consultants that I think was really special, right? You started off as an analyst, and you're just in the ones and zeros, as you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're ripping through systems, doing the analysis, writing reports, and working with an engagement lead. And that engagement lead, eventually you work your way into an engagement lead. That person is responsible for managing the client, right? And before that, there's like a tech lead, right? So you get more of your tech chops, but you kind of get your foot in the door with managing clients. And when you start having the conversations directly with the clients, especially in one-on-one, like, you start to see the human side of it. You see the toll that it has on individuals. I mean, I've been on calls where people literally had to just leave and check themselves into the hospital because they worked themselves into the ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've been on calls with CEOs where they're screaming at everybody, to the point where they're demanding things that just aren't realistic because there's so much emotion tied to that responsibility to get the business moving again. And when I talk to my consultants about this 75% counseling, it's really like, you're just there to listen a lot of times and guide them through that. And it has nothing to do with the technical side. It's really about at the end of the day, like, this is a business problem. Your systems went down. I'm thinking ransomware in this example, right? But, like, systems went down, and like, we have to walk through this and like get you through it. But like, I will carry you to the finish line if I have to, but we're going to get through this together. And it's something that my wife never appreciated, because she never fully understood like why I gave so much effort into these things, like, calls at midnight, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning sort of thing. But when you're putting yourself in their shoes, like, that's where it's just like, there's no way around it, where you're like, I feel bad if I'm not in the middle of it with them, right? And that's the toll that IR providers take on themselves, and that's why there's so much burnout, and why I don't necessarily want to go directly back into that. But it's one of those things where, like, at the end of the day, we're all humans. Like, we're all just trying to get through this, and there's something special about being so close to the problem. And I think that's what is so attractive to so many people, where like they're willing to put in all these hours, because you are helping humans get through it. But in my mind, a lot of the IR side, like when you're reaching and managing clients, it's people problems. It's not technical problems.
Yeah, no, I love the way you frame that, and I love kind of it's really easy mentally to justify that. Well, I have a 9 o'clock call, and then just kind of say that to your family, like, I have a 9 p.m. call, assuming everyone else is like, oh, okay, well, if it's at that hour, it must be important. Instead, it's like, no one else has that. What's wrong with you? I mean, like, I can talk to all my friends and their spouses don't have 9 p.m. calls. Like, that doesn't make sense. And I think cybersecurity in particular has a way of kind of impacting an immediate importance with it, whereas if the accounting team got an email that there was an error at 9 p.m., they're like, well, the banks are closed. We can't do anything about it till tomorrow. I'll deal with it in the morning. Right. Hey, there's money missing. It's like, yeah, but I can't do anything right now, and I'm not going to stress about it. Right. An alert comes in at midnight. Well, I know an adversary can do more in 5 minutes than maybe 5 hours. So I need to be on top of this thing as quick as I possibly can. And I think that importance carries through. I think we could go all day about the emotional intelligence side of it, but I'm glad you got to call that out. Not a final question, but I want to transition a little bit. I believe, in addition to your CISO roles, you're also a very, very, I'm going to say well-known, because your stuff is always popping up in my feeds, content creator as well. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, number one, but then number two, how is this past that we've spent 15, 20 minutes talking about translated into, I need to be sharing some more with people?
Yeah, and I feel like all things go back to my consulting roots here. But one of the things that I recognized in my career was that I just had an innate ability to take very complex material and, frankly, dumb it down to something that less technical or non-technical people can understand, right? And again, it's something that you hone over the years when you're taking complex information from all these investigations, and translating that for a CEO, right? And doing board presentations where nobody knows anything about cybersecurity. And there was a tipping point for me one day. It was early when I was building out some of the threat intel stuff for Corvus, and I was reading an article on Bleeping Computer, and the article had screenshots from IDA Pro in it. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, nobody is going to understand what they're talking about here, right? Like, the only reason I had any inclination of what they were talking about was because I'd done, 10, 12 years of incident response, but most people haven't done that. And so, I'm reading this and I was like, this is not what's important, right? There's other things that they're trying to say that are much, much more important. And so, I was reading all this stuff to try to keep up to date on what's happening. I was like, well, you know what? If I'm reading about this, I might as well just start talking about it as well. And that started into doing some LinkedIn posts. And it morphed into a YouTube channel. It morphed into a newsletter. But, for me, it's the selfish aspect of it is I'm reading all this stuff anyway to kind of keep up to date with it. And so, yeah, if I'm doing that work, how can I give back to the community? And that's really, that formed the whole basis for TeachMyCyber was I'm doing this work anyway because I like it, right? So if I'm doing it, I might as well just, take some extra time and try to help as many other people as I can and just really get to the core of cybersecurity, because there's just so much noise out there and just wasteful information, especially now with, everything with chat GPT. It's like we're going to be in information overload. And so if I can just kind of cut through all of that and just get to the core essence of things that really actually matter in security, that's a win.
I like it. No, I'm glad you do. So as a thank you from a collective community, thanks for sharing that with us. It's great to be able to get that. And I know every time I see it, I'm like, oh, perfect. This is the best way to think about this.
I appreciate that.
Well, Jason, I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit and talk about kind of the vendor side of things and technology decisions. So a lot of our listeners and some of our guests are founders of newer cybersecurity companies, but kind of want to dig in a little bit to when you're bringing in new technology into your stack. Like what does that decision look like? What makes you go look for something new, and kind of what does that process look like for you?
Yeah, so it all starts off with a risk assessment, and that comes down to what are the things I'm most concerned about for the business, right? And so there's a lot of prep work that goes into it. You first get into an environment, you understand it, understand how the business operates, and understand when something goes wrong, where will it go wrong, and how do you stop that from happening? And then you have your just kind of basic foundational side of building out a security program. And so you start with that, and that kind of takes the big cloud of security and says, okay, we're only going to focus on this narrow slice to begin with, right? This is the area where I'm concerned about. And then I go in and say, okay, well, what are the problems that I have? Do I not have enough visibility? Am I spending too many hours manually doing something? Is there just no visibility whatsoever? And so it's really understanding the problem first, and then saying, okay, once I've got that defined, what are my possible solutions, how I can do this, right? Is there something that I can do quickly and at a low cost? Or do I need to bring in technology to support this? And so from there, then it goes into, well, who are the vendors that are out there, right? And so, you'll do some basic searching for it. I always will go to my CISO groups and say, hey, this is what I'm working on. Who knows what tools here? And so you're looking for kind of that personal referral. And then it's about having a lot of conversations, right? Because I noticed this early on. This is when I was looking for some cloud security solutions. And I thought I needed one thing. And I start having conversations and I start learning new things. I was like, oh, well, I wasn't thinking about that. And so you kind of start expanding out, what is it that you're really looking for? And then you go to all these vendors and say, here are the 4 capabilities I'm looking for. How do you try to do this? And that's when you got to cut through the marketing kind of BS of what they claim they can do. And I just do that by asking questions like, how does it actually work? Like, tell me how it fundamentally works. And then you'll quickly find that a lot of vendors will just kind of fold and like they get into these theoretical things versus what they actually can do. And then before we move forward with anything, and this is learned again the hard way, it comes down to how are we going to operationalize this tool in the environment? Because so many tools are bought and then never actually implemented fully or at all, and it may never be used. And so like the CSPMs, I feel like, at least for me, was kind of a crux on this where, we bought a CSPM and we're like, great, we got all the information we needed, and we didn't have a good system to how to use it ongoing. And so at the end of the year, it's like we use this thing like 4 times. Like, what is it really worth the cost? And so that for me is like, oh, okay, we really need to make sure that how are we going to operationalize this into the everyday environment? And so all of that comes together with, choosing the right vendor, making sure that you have a program that supports the use of the technology or whatever it might be. And then like ingraining that into the everyday tasks that your teams are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great lesson for any vendors that are listening as well. Once a sale is over, it's not time to kind of let go and let the customer, onto their own devices, right? It's the vendor's responsibility to make sure that the customer understands exactly how to implement and operationalize the tool to its full capacity. Or again, it's something on the shelf you're looking at saying, why do we have this? No one's using this. So that's, something I learned early in my career. And I think a great point for anybody who listening on the vendor side. for sure.
Well, and there's another point to that you brought up too, I think is important, is after that sale, you go through the onboarding experience and you typically get all the love in the world. And then depending on the vendor, sometimes you never hear from them again. But for some of the more expensive tools that you're bringing in, you'll get some customer success support there. And what's always interesting is after the first year, it's like you start to notice some of the cracks, right? Like the honeymoon phase is over. You can tell that they're starting to get overloaded with other customers. And I typically will see this on response time. And this might be again a character flaw from incident response, but like if I'm asking a question and it's taking 4 days to get a response, like that is not good. And
Yep.
especially if it's a critical question. And so there's just one of those things where I'm not the biggest customer in the world, and I understand that. I'm not expecting, the best service in the world, but I at least want to be heard, right?
Yeah.
And acknowledge that something's going to be there. And so for any vendors, like it's critically important that things don't get lost. You have a responsiveness, even if it's just to say, hey, I've heard you.
Yep.
I'm working on it, and then give updates on that. And so there are very few vendors that I think do that well. And the ones that do that well, those are like, I'd be a customer for life.
Yeah, absolutely. That is something that I try to impress on my team daily is, a response of, hey, got it, working on it it means all the world to somebody, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so when looking at vendors, a lot of the folks we have on the show, they're early stage companies bringing new, exciting, technology to the cybersecurity space. But it's often difficult for them to find their first customers. So I'd love to hear kind of your take on, do you ever work with earlier stage companies? And if so, kind of, what are the things that you look for?
Yeah. So I love startups. Mainly I've worked in startups most of my entire career. So I've got a soft spot for them. But what I really like about them is that they are super focused on a particular problem. Right? And so if it's a problem that I'm looking to solve, I'm willing to go into it and say, like, I know you're not fully there yet, but I'm willing to make a bet for you. And so there are certain things that you're not going to do that with, right? Like some of the core essentials of your security program. So I'll always look to see, like, is there an opportunity to bring somebody in a low risk, high return type opportunity where, if they miss something, it's not the end of the world, but at least like I'll know all the things that they're doing, behind the hood. So I'll understand the gaps. And so it's really important there. And I have less time now to talk to startups, but early on when I had a little bit more time, like I would probably talk to a new startup every couple of weeks, just to kind of learn what they were doing. And then when I had a specific problem, I'd have this catalog of startups ready to go, and then I can go deeper with them. But what I really like is that you have an opportunity to really get the attention to get a custom built. So I'll use custom built in phrases here. But you have this opportunity to get that built specifically for your problems. And you got a narrow window of maybe like a year or so before they start getting more customers, but you can make a lot of progress in that time. And you're helping a company out. And so it's all about balance. Like I wouldn't over index of only working with startups,
Right.
but for like some pretty interesting problems, especially like in the IAM space right now, there's a lot of really cool startups out there that can help solve problems that the bigger players just aren't equipped to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bring up a great point with, kind of helping build that roadmap and having a product that can really help you. And a startup is agile enough to be able to kind of deliver that. Yeah. So also kind of in that vein and in that thread, we hear often from founders, we're not in the magic quadrant. We're not able to participate in the wave. And that doesn't mean that they're not viable companies, right? It just might be that that's not where their marketing dollars are going today, or
Sure.
maybe they don't fit in the defined category and don't want to be stuck in one. So I'd love to kind of hear how the importance that you place on those types of analyst rankings and that world.
I'm laughing because I'm probably going to have to really soften this language here. I just don't buy into it. I think that there are certain companies that have to rely on that, right? There are certain companies where they're going to have to be in a defensible position on the tools that they bought. right? And this is going to be more akin to larger companies, especially when you're dealing with much larger budgets. Uh, it's why so many companies bring in Mandy and CrowdStrike when they have a major hack. It's because, like, the classic phrase, you're never going to get fired for bringing them in, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's the same thing for the Magic Quadrant, like all these analyst reports and everything. They're a good resource, but I have never weighed a buying decision on that. The only time I've leaned into that is if I'm trying to use it to support the budget, right? And so, like, that's where it goes into it. I don't believe in it, but it's like everybody knows, Gartner, whoever, like, so you got it, like, that's the game. That said, like, for startups, obviously they're not going to be on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like a lot like cyber security certificates. Like, I'm never going to knock somebody for not having one. If you have it, great, but I'm also not putting a lot of weight into it. Like, what I care about is, what are you actually solving? And is what you're saying actually true, right? Can you live up to what you say you can do? And that's like, it takes more effort, especially with startups, because you're really digging into the nitty gritty of how they're trying to do what they're doing. But you do have a good idea. And as long as you're paying attention and know your gaps, then you're okay. So yeah, I think it's a crutch is basically what those reports are. And they're kind of a necessary evil for a lot of companies, but I would never want to start there, I guess is the right way to say it.
Hey, Jason, one thing that we've heard from quite a few CISOs we've had on the show has been that startups are really good for newer spaces or maybe things that are not as attractive to larger players. And not that it's not an attractive thing, but it's more about pivoting on newer threats and being able to do it from a smaller footprint, as opposed to, well, let me spin up this massive development engineering engine to attach what is a subset of the threat space right now. And I find that to be like a really interesting comparison between the two, only because it's kind of like a recognition of, okay, here's the latest threats on the, on the forefront, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to go to someone who's more nimble and agile, but for my larger attack surfaces, or perhaps my maybe more predictable or legacy attack surfaces, I'm going to lean on, legacy vendors. And I'm not using legacy in that like typical computer term here, more of like established, if you will. Maybe that's a better phrase for it and whatnot. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, because what the legacy companies are going to have is scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just going to be more reliable. But they're not going to be able to move as fast, right? So, like I mentioned IAM before, and I think it's the perfect space to kind of tie that together. Right now you have you basically have Okta, Microsoft, and then some others, but like they're the main players at IAM. They're doing a great job on and somebody's going to argue that, which is fine, right? But they're doing their job on authentication, and it's working for the most part. But where I think they're lagging is on the detection side. Like there are no good capabilities built in there. And so that's where you start seeing a lot of these startups pop up, where you're having, this identity, threat detection and response tools that are starting to kind of fill out to say, hey, nobody else is doing this, but the attacks are going there. Just look at MGM, right? And we need to be able to detect these things fast, respond, and do something about it. And the legacy players just aren't moving fast enough to do that. I mean, that's why you have like Cisco. I think it was Cisco bought Ort, right? That's like the thing. You're going to start seeing these companies get scooped up, and hopefully it starts to get integrated in. But yeah, I'm just never going to rely on a big incumbent security company to really push the boundaries on some of these emerging areas, just because they've got another business to run.
Yeah. I'm curious, given your viewpoint, I think you talked at the very beginning about kind of the network of CISOs that you work with. And I'm going to say that your viewpoint is probably force multiplied because you've got so many different feeds and inputs. Is it that an attack occurs? So IR mindset, right? An attack occurs and all of a sudden everyone is like, whoa, I need that technology. Or is it a newer thing comes out, it gets widely adopted, and then everyone says, we should probably protect this thing before it gets too bad? I'm curious which side you maybe see more.
Yeah, it's definitely the latter. Take a lot of like Gen AI stuff as an example. When that really started to come out, you have the whole FUD cycle where people are freaking out that, attackers are going to use it and blah, blah, blah. And, I have many thoughts on that. But a lot of it was coming out on, okay, let's understand, in our CISO group. So I was chatting, all right, let's understand how the technology works. What are the fundamentals behind it and what are the risks, right? So we start off in more of like a theoretical kind of realm and start putting some controls in place. A lot of it really all started with policies, right? And just general guidance. And then you start saying, okay, where are we seeing more risk start to pop up? And let's try to go solve that, right? And so it's much more in that realm. Now that I'm thinking about it, like I don't often see. Let's take MGM as an example. When that happened and Okta started releasing guidance and things and remediation, like I was looking at that and I'm like, hey, team on my side, like, what do we not have in place that they're recommending, right? And let's make sure that we've got this in place. I don't know that I saw other CISOs doing that. That's not to say they haven't done that, right? But I think it's got to be a balance between the two. Like, if you're waiting for the threat to happen, you're already too late. But if you're not doing anything when something else when a bad thing happens and learning from the mistakes of others, like that's a lost opportunity for you.
Yeah, I feel like it's a weird balance of I don't want to be too early, and it's not like I don't think you can prevent an attack too early. I don't think that's what I'm saying, but more of like I don't want to invest in a technology or spin up resources or spin up cycles for something that I don't even know how much it impacts my organization. Right. We just rolled this thing out 3 months ago. We're only at 40% adoption. It's taken a while to get there. My initiative right now is completing the adoption. It's not wrapping controls around a thing that outside of the normal standard recommendations. Right. And then that 40% rollout becomes 100% of the entry vector. And you're like, well, dang, like it's tough to shift that focus and all of a sudden be like, well, when should I have started? And obviously there's an argument for security implementations at the beginning of stuff, but I think more what I'm leaning towards is, assuming everyone's following best practices and guidances from the vendor and things like that. I find that there is a stage of like, okay, it's implemented. Do I dump all the logs into a SIM? Do I start to build detections for them? Do I start to feed them into a whatever? Oh, wait, all of my big vendors don't even have ingestions for this yet. It's so new. Right. So there's a trade-off there of like, does that mean I don't implement, or does that mean right now I'm limited on what I can do with security controls? And then I'll tie this back. As an incident responder, I know you and I both were in situations where someone would give you a set of logs and be like, hey, here's what we're using for password management. And I remember being like, what is this tool? Like, I've never heard of this thing before, and then I read about it and it's a vendor. They've got, or it's a product, right? They've got 2,000 customers. They're making a few tens of millions a year in sales. And I'm like, how did you even how did you find this thing? And I maybe this is more of a reflection than anything else. I think it's a really tough trade-off for folks to know, okay, I'm going after this thing to solve this niche problem. I can't even begin to wrap the same controls around it as I can. And I'll use an extreme example here, Windows endpoint detection, right? Maybe it's maturity of the space, but then the other side of it might just be, we're just not there yet. And it's a tough trade-off. So I appreciate you recognizing like, it might not even be a CISO's to do afterwards is to think about that next step just because it is so new,
Yeah. And I feel like it's almost like playing a game of chutes and ladders. Like there's no ladder that goes straight to the end for an attacker, right? Like they're going to have to hit other elements in your environment or stack or whatever. And so, even if you don't have something perfect right off the bat after implementing or whatever it might be, you're kind of not hoping, but you should be planning for it of, where else is this going to kind of hit along the way that we're going to have something else that will tip us off, right? And that's where like detection and response is, biased, right? But it's a little bit of an unsung hero there where you have to recognize you're not going to stop everything. And so, if I know I'm not going to stop everything, well, I better make sure that I've got a solid detection and response capability. So at least I can try to minimize the damage. And that's, a lot easier said than done.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, this is giving me a lot to think about and reflect on now as well.
Well, Jason, this has been incredibly insightful for us and as well as the audience, I'm sure. We have one final question to kind of wrap it up, and that would be, if we have a lot of practitioners who listen to these episodes as well, and folks who might be thinking, hey, I want to move into that CISO role someday. What advice would you give to those folks considering that?
So I would really ask yourself, like, what is it that you want out of the CISO role? Because I hear a lot of people who want to step into it, and I don't think many people appreciate what the day-to-day looks like for a CISO. I was having a conversation with somebody on this the other day. I was like, the CISO role is more human relationships than it is technical aspects. And I struggle with this a lot where, I don't know if I would consider myself hardcore technical anymore. And most of the time is, how do I build relationships with other people in the business, and how do I work with them to get things done with a security agenda? And that's the role of a CISO, is managing the risk at a business level, but also being smart enough to know the right questions to ask on the technical side. And so, I think one thing that I learned early in my career is, like, don't chase the title. Really focus in on what it is you enjoy doing. And for a lot of people, they want to stay hardcore technical, and that's just not the role of a CISO. Even though, many companies are trying to make it that, where it's a kind of business leader and, technical practitioner. But I personally just feel that leads to failure, especially in larger companies. And so, yeah, the best advice I can give is really, really understand what it is you're looking for out of that role. Because the title and everything that comes with it, it means nothing if you don't actually enjoy what you're doing.
I love it. Great advice. Jason, thank you so much for being here with us today. And a huge thanks to everyone who listens as well. I can just say that, Jason, you are yet another one of our guests who Jessica and I are already like, when can we get him back on? Because I know there's a ton more things that we want to dig into with you, but we'll keep it there. And great advice for everyone out there, folks. For anyone who's interested or a little more curious, Jason, maybe one final little plug. Where can folks kind of learn more about you or learn more about the company you're at, or let's take a quick 60 seconds or so and let them know where they can find more of Jason.
Yeah, follow me on LinkedIn and subscribe to my newsletter. It's a weekly newsletter where I talk about the weekly things that are happening in security.
Awesome. All right, Jason, thanks again for being here. Our listeners, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Jessica, thank you for joining me on all of these wonderful journeys here.
Absolutely.
It's
a pleasure.
I look forward. I'll talk to you all again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.